Now we welcome our man, Kyle Klingman, host of On the Mat, here to our International Podcast Day Wrestling Edition. Kyle and I started podcasting, 2008, 2009, and now he is the voice behind On the Mat, been a voice of that radio/podcast for a long time. Kyle, from your speakeasy to mine, welcome.
Thanks, man. I appreciate this. Hard to believe that we made it this far after being in a basement for years, or a year, and here we are together on the call, so I appreciate it.
And I'm back in a Minnesota basement, too, so, I mean, this is like kind of throwing it back for us, although there's no dogs going to be interrupting the show today.
A little disappointed to hear that.
Yeah, I don't know if that dog's even with us anymore, but what we're talking about today is podcasting. And Kyle, even prior to our foray into the digital world of Wrestling 411 back in 2008, you were hosting a show when you were working with what was then known as see if I can get the acronym right here, the Dan Gable International Wrestling Institute and Museum. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, it was the worst, no offense, but it was the worst acronym ever. Now with the merger with the Hall of Fame, just simply the National Wrestling Hall of Fame's Dan Gable Museum. Now, since then, you are back with SportEngine and Track Wrestling as a content producer and doing a lot of video there, a lot of podcasts with your co-host Andy Hamilton. But let's go back in time to when On the Mat launched, what it was, how it was, and I mean maybe some of the troubles that went along with it.
Well, the show really falls in line with working with you in a lot of ways. I don't know that we would be a podcast without Jason Bryant, and we can get into some of that, but it was a live radio show starting out on KCNZ 1650 AM locally in Cedar Falls, Waterloo. Fortunately, we had an opportunity to have that broadcast over, at that time it would be the internet and you could access it, but it was pretty archaic. You could listen to it live. We had some problems recording it for a while. Then you got on board when you were at USA Wrestling and you recorded it. And then it became a podcast and it went from there. But it was live and we had commercials in it. And we had a formula where we had a 20-minute segment and then a guest and a guest. And it's just different radio when you have to go live. It's just a different product because you have to be on. You have to refresh the audience on who the guest is. So just a different product than podcasting, because podcasting, there is no limitations. You can go 2 hours if you want. And so I miss that part of it. I like live radio, and I don't know if there's as many opportunities right now for live radio with podcasts.
Yeah, one thing, but what you're seeing is a lot of these radio shows now that are iHeart stations they're basically like, we had Anthony and Gennaro talking about Mike and the Cowherd and stuff. Those are radio shows that are then put in as a podcast, whereas On the Mat now, since you've fully, you'd left the Gable Museum to join Track Wrestling and brought the show with you, as there was no longer a place for it on the radio, I think was the actual situation. I'm not trying to throw KCNZ under the bus by any stretch of the imagination, but the format worked, and where you and Andy could do your 20 to 25 minutes of here's what we need to talk about, here's what you and I need to talk about as wrestling people, and then you're not limited by an 18-minute station break to break up an interview with Jim Miller when he's telling a story about working out with Gable or something like that. So what I've found is, you can be 58 minutes, you can be an hour and 58 minutes. The best thing about a podcast in terms of what we're looking at for the wrestling is it's as long as you need it to be. So if you've got 15 minutes of content, make it 15 minutes. If you've got an hour and 15 minutes of content, make it an hour and 15 minutes.
I agree with that. It's a better product all the way around. And it got frustrating at times because you get to that last guest and it'd be 15 minutes. And if the previous guest went long, you'd have 12 minutes and it might be a great guest and you only get to one or two questions. And then they get frustrated because you have to cut them off. And I remember it happened with Damian Hahn, and someone even made a comment like, hey, you should never cut someone off like that. And we had no option. We had to cut them off at the end.
The Cubbies were throwing first pitch.
And yeah, we would get nicks for the Cubs because the Cubs were on that station. So we were absolutely secondary, as we should be, because the Cubs are what drives that station. But it was fun. I'm glad that we had the podcast. I'm glad you recorded it for us. And I'd love to know from you, did you just take the time at 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock, whatever time zone you were in, and just hit the record button and you were on it?
Yeah, because it started because when we split from 411, I went to USA Wrestling. You went back to the museum, and Kent Sesker was also hosting the show in your absence. And then it was back to you. So what had happened? What happened is when I'm in Colorado, so I'm at a Mountain Time Zone, which made a 4 o'clock record time in the Mountain Time Zone a little easier. So what I found a program called Audio Hijack, and then you guys streamed it. I'm not really sure exactly what the format was at the time, but I could hit play, and Audio Hijack would actually record browser audio. So this comes it's not even an inside joke. It was actually a legit time. So about 5 minutes prior, at 3:50, I'd set a reminder on my calendar, like on the mat, ding, like 5 minutes prior. I would grab my phone, I would text Kyle and say, "Start stream reminder," because if they didn't start the stream on the web, I couldn't record it. So there's a couple episodes. Okay, there's more than a couple episodes in there where the first 1, 2, or 5, or even 15 minutes are cut off, and trying to call the station to try to get, Scott Fensloff, who's produced the show, because he's busy producing the show. He can't always answer the phone, and it's after the office is closed because it's 5 o'clock Central. And it was a reminder, because it was a point where Wednesdays I definitely planned dinner around it. I was a newlywed at the time. I'm like, when Abby was working remotely in Tennessee, it wasn't that terrible, so I'd just stay in the office and record and listen to it. But yeah, and then you had Scott send me some CDs that contained some episodes from 2010. I think Rene Goulet was on one of them. I mean, some of the pro wrestling tie-ins too from the Gable Museum. And so basically we built the back catalog. I know that there are numbered, I think we figured out there's 618 episodes, 616 episodes, but like the first 200 don't even exist anywhere. So it's just when recording and putting that show in, and it was with the Matt Chat feed. And then I left USA Wrestling and started Short Time, and then put it on the Short Time feed. And then all of a sudden I'm like, okay, got 2 different shows here. Let's create the Matt Talk Podcast Network. And Short Time was the first show, and On the Mat created its second feed. And that's how all this was born, Kyle. That's how all this was born. That's how the Speakeasy was born.
I didn't know some of that history, and it is funny to think back. So we started On the Mat in 2007. I think it was like January 3rd of 2007. And if we wanted a show recorded, we actually had to have a cassette tape and pop it in there if we really wanted it. So
what's a cassette?
Exactly.
Well, I mean, I got plenty of them. I got bootlegs here, but from shows. But yeah, so we've gone from cassette. I don't think you guys ever sent me any cassettes, but you sent me some CDRs. I did actually try to record some stuff back in the day with a mini disc, but that format never really took hold. But when we get to what's going on with track wrestling now, because there's been a couple different podcasts that have come and gone, and you guys have finally kind of concentrated it to On the Mat. David Mirikitani was hosting a show. Alex Steen was part of one. I basically took your Countdown to Nur Sultan series and made that a 3-minute, 100 episode, basically 3 to 4 minute audio series. 7 minutes is coming on How Wrestling Built Me. So you guys are still working around what formats work, and then with the COVID-19 situation, you've done a lot. You've gotten really good at video conferencing. So explain how podcasting really fits into the SportEngine and track wrestling model of things.
I think podcasting really is everything in a lot of ways, because it allows you to, like you said, have no restrictions on what you can do, how long you need to go. If it's not going in a good direction, you can cut it off at 10 minutes, or if it's just rolling, you can go for an hour. And in our case, we've been able to take it and chop it up into different segments, which I think is really good. So podcasting really is the future. As you've seen, look at your lineup, man. I mean, you have so many guests for today, just scrolling through and seeing who you have. It really is something that is what was cutting edge at one point. I think we were kind of one of the first to do it when we were with 411. I don't know, there was a lot doing it. And now it's just everyone's in the game, and you just have to get creative and find your own niche.
You're a guy that likes Bob Dylan. You're a guy that likes music. You're a guy that likes ultra running, and you've been a runner and such. So when it comes to podcasts that don't involve wrestling, I'm curious what Kyle Klingman listens to.
There's a Sam Harris podcast that I like and I listen to. I like The Office Ladies. That's a good podcast.
That's about The Office, the TV show, right?
Yep.
I think I just heard about that like 2 days ago.
Yeah, really good. I love The Office. I don't know if you're a fan of it or not, but
we just finished the series. We went start to finish. Finished it about a month ago.
For the first time, or had you seen it?
I got up to about, I think when I moved from Pennsylvania is where I kind of lost it, and then I would pick up pieces of it. Because I remember after the NCAAs in 2019, I'm sitting with some buddies after we have brunch. We're just waiting for our ride to the airport, and there's an episode of The Office that was on. I'm like, I haven't seen this one, and I'm not really sure which season it was from. And then then there's a part where Creed's playing hooky and he hops on the bus. And I thought that was earlier in the series. And that's like one of the last seasons. And I'm like, wait, I've been waiting for that segment for the entire time. And that's because, again, it was kind of all over the place on where The Office is, where I was watching it. But yeah, so The Office Ladies is one I actually wrote down to have to check out. I might have to do another rewatch.
That's good. I like those would be the two that my go-to ones that I like. So, and then there's some that people will just send you and say, hey, check this out. And I like to listen to, but yeah, those are my two go-tos. One
thing that I actually discovered a couple days ago, I actually listened to it. I think I saw a tweet about it. It was about marathon investigations. And now the podcast isn't live anymore. They haven't done a show in about a year, but it was an episode where it was a guy that investigates people that cheating races and stuff. And it's like he's got a whole website, a podcast about cheating ultra marathons and stuff like that, and people finding certain races that, I mean, basically there's a niche for everything. If you just want to talk about Iowa wrestlers from the 70s, you can create a podcast solely about that. So that's kind of a strength in the format.
It is, and you can go any direction you want. I think that's good, is that you can make it niche, which is really cool, and you don't have to just have broad strokes. And it really does allow you to have a theme for your show, and you think about a lot of these live shows, you have to have a broad base. And you've probably listened to a lot of live radio through the course of your life, and you think about it, just, hey, you might have guests on for football, basketball, wrestling, and try to really develop a show that way. But that's a good point, man, to be able to really lock in. And you just had the D3 guys, man, you can get in and be as detailed as you want.
In being a national outlet, and you've had the background of covering Division III. Matter of fact, you're the one that brought me into the Division IIIs the first year in 2019 or 2009 when we were with 411. And, you know, I saw the love for that tournament and the fans. We just talked about that with the Bonaventura. That's a long name to say, the Twins of D3 Nation. So when it comes to a guest, I mean, now it's a weekly show. You've got also videos that are coming in there. You know, I know you like Brahman Creighton, who's a fascinating individual. Was on a trip with him back in 2012 to the Junior World Championships in Pattaya, Thailand. And then you've got your go-tos. I mean, you always like talking about Titan Mercury. You always like talking to Gable based on that relationship. Jim Miller is an individual who doesn't get enough credit across the sport of wrestling. So where do you and Andy, as hosts, I mean, you guys have known each other for probably 20 years at this point, develop your synergy and the mindset of, okay, here's the guest we're going to bring on. Why is it going to be relevant for this week's conversation?
Well, I think you just hit on it. It's going to be relevant for that week. For the most part, we try to steer clear of just having someone that's just going to be on just to be on. So I think we always ask two questions. Is it relevant to today, or is their story relevant? So those are the two things that drive how we get a guest. And if their story is still relevant, we're more than happy to have them on. But we're not going to just have someone on just because, hey, they won a state title in 1971 and we just want to relive some memories. If their story is still relevant and we feel like we can go down that road, like a Wayne Wells, I don't think we've had him on, but his story is extremely relevant. You want to talk about maybe the most underrated, underappreciated wrestler in all of wrestling, the first world champion to win an Olympic gold medal, won it in 1970 and then 1972. He went into law. So he kind of got lost in the shuffle because he never went into coaching after that. But I think it's the relevant question. Is the person relevant? Is the story relevant? And when they are, we want to have that person on.
When you were with the Gable Museum, there was also the tie-in with the professional wrestling wing. And for years, and I actually had a conversation with I've had conversation with Jerry Briscoe about this and wrestling fans overall about there used to be this divide, this basically this discontent for professional wrestling from our world of amateur wrestling. And I don't like the term amateur wrestling. Because I think professional wrestling invented it, which professional wrestling is now sports entertainment, and we get into the nomenclature issues and things of that nature. But there's a tie with it in Minnesota with the Vern Gagne AWA thing. But the Gable Museum, I mean, the founder Mike Chapman was also a fan of professional wrestling in that regard, and going back to the days of Hackenschmidt and Frank Gotch and such. And when you were doing shows with the pro wrestlers for the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame, was there pushback from our wrestling community? Be like, why are you doing that? I've always been curious about that.
Not really. I think because we always had someone on that has a respect for amateur wrestling or could talk about it. So even if it's Jim Ross, who never stepped foot on a mat, he's going to talk about Dan Hodge and growing up with him, and he had relationships with those guys. So I don't think he ever got pushback. I think in any for a reason, I don't know why, but I think there was a fascination on what these guys were going to say. And I've always said this, Jason, that I feel like professional wrestlers respect amateur wrestling, which I don't think either of us like that term, but we'll call it that, amateur wrestling, more than amateur wrestling does, because I think they're in awe of it. They're like, these guys are so good at what they do, and in some ways they couldn't do it either. Maybe they could fill 100,000 people for WrestleMania, but they couldn't get on the mat and perform at that high of a level. And I think people were fascinated by what they had to say about amateur wrestlers, and I respected that too, because one of my favorite stories is after one of the banquets, and actually we went up there. You know who Mick Foley and Terry Funk are, I'm assuming. So
no recollection of Terry Funk pile driving Ric Flair on a table outside a Clash of Champions. No idea Mankind taking the tumble off. Okay, yeah, go ahead. I know you're talking.
Well, you do know. Anyway, Gable is meeting these guys for the first time, and Mick Foley and Terry Funk are just beside themselves. They're like, "Oh, Mr. Gable, how you doing?" And they talk to him for 5 minutes, and then Gable pulls me to the side. He said, "Hey," he goes, "who were those guys?" And then after the banquet, we went back to the museum. And he looks around. He's like, "Hey," he goes, "is anyone here?" And I go, "No." He goes, "Those pro wrestlers love me." And they did. They had to give that honor to him and that respect. And Gable, you just throw the name around in professional wrestling, gives you street cred. So I've always appreciated professional wrestlers' appreciation for amateur wrestling.
And one thing that's also pretty cool about that is the with the curtain being pulled back, so to speak. I mean, we've got a lot of professional wrestling podcast shows. I think you could have probably done International Wrestling Podcast Day with 800 professional wrestling podcasts. I mean, there are a lot out there, but I know Conrad Thompson's has a show with Eric Bischoff and Jim Ross and Bruce Pritchard, and all, those guys have been through the Gable Museum a time or two with the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame inductions and such. And it's just funny to see the pro wrestlers mark out, and it's a wrestling term, for Gable, and then all of a sudden you got the lines of people waiting in line for Dolph Ziggler, who is Nick Nemeth, who my roommate wrestled at Nationals, and it's strange of the dichotomy of a word you like of how the wrestling fans are wrestling fans from over here, and then wrestling fans over here, and then there's that glimmer of people in the middle that really appreciate both, and that's one thing that the first iteration, I guess, of On the Mat did, and you've continued that through its current iteration, as I said, iteration twice in one sentence. But now we get to, in our last 10 or so minutes of this particular segment, On the Mat with Andy. You've had some interesting co-hosts. On the Mat has had Doug Van Gelder, Hail Caesar. You've had Kent Sesker hosting the show. Jeff Bradley did a Panther Wrestling Club edition once a month. And from what you've seen On the Mat evolve from and what it's at now, what's your favorite thing about co-hosting the show with Andy Hamilton now?
I think it's that we both come into it from a space of really wanting to give the guest full recognition for what he or she has done. And it really is about the guest, and that we get to dive as deep as possible. And that's what's cool, is that Andy came on as the co-host while we were still doing it live, and that lasted for a little while. Then we went to the podcast form. But I think that's the best part of it, is that he might ask a question that I had no thought process of why he asked that question. It was a really good question. And I think that's the best part of it, is that seeing someone else's mind work and how they articulate a question, and never have thought to ask that question. So I always appreciate that he has questions that I wouldn't ask, and hopefully he would say the same thing about me.
We look at the shows that you guys have, and the most recent one with Mike Finn, the Mighty Finn, you guys call him, Andy's former neighbor in Coralville. I remember staying with Andy one time when I totaled my car. Actually, it was National Duels with 411. I totaled my car. I had to go back to Davenport to get it out of a scrapyard. I had my new car. I was on my way to Purdue in Iowa, and then UTC in Northern Iowa, and then Minnesota, Iowa that weekend. And it was just a very, very weird thing. And yeah, Andy goes, "Yeah, Mike Finn lives right there." As I go to sing karaoke at the bar down the street. So so Andy and your rapport with Mike Finn this last episode, again, he's probably one of the more frequent guests on the show, but you've had hundreds of guests, probably thousands at this point. There any guests from On the Mat that stand out and be like, wow, that was a great interview. We really need to get them on again?
Well, the one that always comes to mind, and it wasn't even On the Mat, it was Wrestling 411, and we did it, was, I don't know what it was, but when we had Jamie Pollard and Kevin Jackson on the show together, Kevin had just gotten hired, and they were driving down to Kansas City. I don't know why, man, but that felt larger than life. It just felt like, wow, we're really doing something, moving the needle here. We got the AD in the car and Kevin Jackson, and that just felt like we really were doing something special there, and I really appreciated that. Of course, anytime you have Gable on the show, he's always going to give you some gold nuggets in there, and you appreciate that. But I'll tell you what, that Kevin Jackson interview that we did, that was just really special to me.
What's funny about that whole year, and I know we actually did a podcast about kind of chronicling that year in its entirety, how you and I both approached it, and you know, the personal relationships that came out of that, and you know, it was a really interesting year. But it's funny to look back at what we were doing 12 years ago. It's 2008, 2009. It was weird. 11/11/08. We had our first show with Tom Brands at Augsburg College, and then to see where the shows are out, and then technology like this, the StreamYard, for example, is an Ecamm exists out there, and OBS, all the technology. Man, Kyle, if we had this technology 12 years ago, we might still be going. Is it crazy to think about?
It is, because I tell you what, you can't really explain how primitive and archaic we were starting out that show.
And we were technologically advanced while being primitive and archaic.
Dude, it was, I mean, that first show, if you go listen to that Tom Brands episode, it was rough, man. I mean, just absolutely rough. And it was just, we didn't know what we were doing on this. We're in this KOG studio. You knew what you were doing. I certainly didn't know anything of what I was doing. You had all the tech side, but man alive, you just think about being able to click a button and you give me a link and I'm in this show right now. It still floors me a little bit that we have this technology and the capability to do this. I shake my head at how rough it was when we started 2007 and then 2008, 2009. It was rough.
It's one of those things that where we look back and we're like, man, we did this. And I think a short story before we let you go, take our little 5-minute changeover and bring Eric Olenowski on, is actually, I got to look at the schedule to make sure we got that right, because it's on MadTalkOnline.com/IPD2020. Actually, KJ Pilcher is up next, then Eric Olenowski. So we stick with the Iowans. But it was the big story that year wasn't just, it was the coaching changes, because we had so many dominoes fall again, but was the first year of the new qualifier system. And I think that's really where I think both of us, I can't speak really for you, but I assume both of us really made our inroads with the NCAA in terms of Brad Traviola was on with us multiple times that year explaining the qualification process. We were at your buddy's house in Austin, Texas, trying to maybe do the interview, and like, oh, we got to wait. So we got in the car and we drove together for almost a month. And we were in Schulenburg, Texas, in this hotel room that's reeked of cleaning agent, because probably somebody smoked in there the night before, sitting on a bed doing a podcast from my relatively brand new Mac. And if we needed to do that again today, we could do it again today.
Those were good times. I think we went to the Alamo too, didn't we?
We did. We did that on our way to D2s. We stayed at the Smithsonian, and that was the first time I met the late Leroy Smith Sr. And I just remember asking him, and this is all podcast related, it's just because of my podcast, sitting in Leroy Smith Sr.'s living room, sitting on the couch, ask him, who's the most notable person to sit where I'm sitting right now? And you see Big Leroy scratch his head, and you go, well, Kenny slept on that couch before, meaning Kenny Monday. And, Alexander Medved sat there one time right where you're sitting. I'm like, oh my, right on that very couch. And I'm like, and this is funny because when he's showing us those pictures, well, that's Christopher there, Chris Perry with the pink hat on backwards. And then he was showing us the baseball trophies. Well, one of those baseball trophies was JT Realmuto. If you go back and think about it, he didn't say it was at the time. I can't remember him saying this, but he was pointing the trophies to his grandkids playing baseball, and JT Realmuto, Major League Baseball, he's kind of a big deal now. His trophies are in there right next to John Smith's World Championship trophy. It was still one of the most remarkable experiences that I got to see, and you were there with us.
Yeah, it was fun, man. And it's It really is. As we talk about podcasting, man, you want to talk about an odd couple, me and you being together. I can't even believe it. I mean, I don't know that there could be any more polar different people than you and me on this planet, and we made it work. And I thought it was a really good show, and I think it was good because we came into it from a different angle. And I can still remember you slipping me a note. I said Logan Stieber wrong, and you slipped over a note. I said Stieber. You slipped over a note and said it's Stieber. So just those little memories, you know. I don't know at that point I'd heard of Logan Stieber yet, but you had, and he was in high school. I don't know if we were talking about him or interviewing him. I think we interviewed Helen Maroulis young. So
yeah, Adeline Gray, Randy Miller, Chaz Betts. I mean, we went through world teamers and such. Okay, real quick before we go, we got a question from our man from Twitter. He's been asking a lot of questions. So J to the, well, I can't say his old handle. How often do you get to work with Richard Emmel, and what's it like?
Not enough. I'm a big fan of Richard Emmel. I don't think he appreciates when I'm a fan of his sometimes, because like, that dude's awesome. That guy,
I helped him move. That's how awesome he is. Like, that's how much you like somebody, when you help them move without actually them asking until, hey, are you available Monday? Like, I told you, let's do it.
That's such a good question, because I think about it all the time, because I am in the same company as Richard Emmel, and I never get to talk to him, never get to work with him. Like maybe once every 3 to 4 months we engage in a conversation, and that's not enough. That guy is a really big asset for wrestling, and he should be celebrated, man. He's really good at what he does.
Kyle Klingman, co-host of On the Mat. You see it right there. Found anywhere where good podcasts are found. Don't worry about where the bad ones are found. You can find it on MatTalkOnline.com, one of our signature shows. So, Kyle, we got KJ Pilcher coming up soon. So, in a sign-off, you got 20 seconds. Take us home.
Thanks for making the On the Mat a reality. We wouldn't be a podcast without Jason's work and recording it in some primitive days, so we appreciate it. Thank you.